So, allow me to introduce Sophia Mo, who is assistant professor in the Department of Francophone Studies here at the University of Kansas. And please go ahead, Sophia, and take over.
Sure. Thank you so much, Glenn. I'd like to start by thanking the Kansas African Studies Center for making it possible to broadcast these conversations to a larger audience. Thank you, Glenn, for inviting me to interview Majid Hannoum about his book, which we're very eager to hear about today. And of course, thank you to all of the members of the audience for being in attendance today. I heard from a couple of other people that they'll be coming in a little bit late because class ends at 12:20, so we'll see a couple more people show up. All right, so we are incredibly fortunate to have Dr. Majid Hannoum speak with us today about his latest book. Dr. Hannoum is professor of anthropology at the University of Kansas, and he's one of the leading scholars of North African studies, or to be more precise, of anthropological, historical, and cultural studies of the region of Africa that has come to be known as the Maghreb. Majid's research analyzes the construction of political and historical discourse on a wide range of topics, including secularism, state violence, modernity, colonialism and post-coloniality, migration, and citizenship. Secular Narrations and Transdisciplinary Knowledge, which was published with Routledge last year, is his fifth monograph and the focal point of today's conversation. Majid is also the author of several other critically acclaimed works, including The Invention of the Maghreb, Between Africa and the Middle East, Living Tangier, Migration, Race and Illegality in a Moroccan City, and Violent Modernity, France and Algeria. He's also edited a volume of collected essays entitled Practicing Sufism, Sufi Politics and Performance in Africa. Majid, before coming to KU, has taught at Princeton University, the College of New Jersey, the New School for Social Research, and Bard College. Currently in the Department of Anthropology at KU, he teaches courses such as religion, power, and sexuality in Arab societies, as well as magic, science, and religion. Majid has been a fellow at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton and the Center for Middle Eastern Studies at Harvard University. In the Department of Anthropology at Columbia University, Majid has been a visiting scholar, and he's also been a senior Fulbright Fellow twice, as well as a senior fellow at the Aga Khan Center in London. I suppose that not everyone in the audience has had the chance to read Majid's book, so here, let me start with a quick overview. Secular Narrations and Transdisciplinary Knowledge is a collection of standalone essays and book reviews combining the old with the new. In short, it's about how narrative is politics. And one of the defining characteristics of Majid's work is its critical and deconstructive bite. The common thread is his drive to take apart the narratives that we take for granted and to show us how they're put to work and translated in order to construct and maintain hierarchies. However, just as discourse can be used to exercise power and enact violence, Majid also reminds us, very importantly, that discourse is fragile. As such, discourse can be broken down and rebuilt differently. In short, narratives don't always have to protect the status quo. They can also destabilize the status quo. More specifically, in this volume of essays, Majid interrogates narratives about secularism, or keeping religion separate from politics. Each standalone chapter takes us through a different narrative form or set of narratives, but each of them is linked via its case study of specific manifestations of secular discourse. So Majid here walks us through articulations of secularism across space and time, and how these constructions of secularism are disseminated, translated, and then put to work in politics and in truth claims. He demonstrates how secularism has come to be associated with political modernity, and how secularism has become a condition of so-called legitimate discourse. However, Majid also takes care to show that secular discourse and religious discourse are not mutually exclusive. In fact, secular narratives often include religious discourse. In doing so, Majid deconstructs this idealized separation that is often drawn between religion and politics. As I alluded to earlier, 3 of the essays in this volume are new. The first on translation and the imaginary, the second on translations of Fanon, and the third on the plurality of secularisms. The other chapters have previously been published elsewhere. So without further ado, let's get started with the interview portion of this talk. Okay, Majid, since not everyone here has read your book yet, I'm going to begin with some very broad inquiries before moving into questions about specific claims, and then I'll ask audience members to contribute their own questions. So my first question is about your trajectory as a scholar. This collection of essays is a compilation of your previous work, with a couple of additional chapters on translation, Fanon, and the plurality of secularisms. Could you tell us a little bit more about what drew you to investigate discourse around secularism in the
Could you
first
please say
place?
I missed something?
Yeah, sure. So could you tell us about what drew you to the topic of secularism and discourses around secularism?
Hmm.
And then could you tell us a little bit more about how your understanding of what secularism even is has changed over time?
So those are three questions, right?
That's right,
One,
yes.
the itinerary, right? If I understood you correctly. And second one is about the analysis of discourse and how I came into it, which is of course related to the first question. And third one is my understanding of secularism. So I would like to start with an anecdote actually to answer your first question. And first of all, thank you very much for this great introduction. Your summary of my book, I mean, it was just beyond what I expected. You know, it's really brilliant. And of course, thank you to the African Studies Center. Thank you to Glenn, who graciously invited me. And thank you to, thanks to everybody here who came to participate in this discussion. So I said I would like to start with an anecdote. I had a job interview one time in one of the top schools in Europe, actually. And that was a while ago. It was, I think, before I came to KU, basically. And I remember one of the members of the search committee had his CV in front of me, and he would go really line by line about what they have done, you know, pretty much since since the back, you know. And of course, I mean, like it had the impression that it was like he was prizing me, but at the same time, I was expecting something else, which didn't disappoint me really. It came out. Then he told me, I have a question for you. I said, yes. And he said, are you still searching for yourself? And it was really a critique. I mean, like it was supposed to be a devastating critique, meaning that I didn't know what I wanted in life, and more specifically in academic life. And because I've been studying all these things, you know, that he saw in my CV, some of which I will talk about. And of course, the answer was also unexpected, you know, as far as he was concerned. I told him, yes, of course, I'm still like searching for myself. And that the nature of academic journey is precisely, you know, a constant search. I said the day that I would stop searching, I would die academically, you know. And now I go back to the trajectory, and of course, the trajectory is now like more than 30 years. So I became one of the senior colleagues in the field. The trajectory, I did Arabic literature. I did really classical Arabic literature in Morocco. And I was more interested in like Abbasid, which is basically 9th, 10th century poetry, and I wrote an MA thesis about it. But once I moved to France, I was more interested also like in French literature, and basically I was very fascinated by 19th century and especially like literary criticism of the 19th century, with a specific interest in the work of Sainte-Beuve. So it happened that there was a book called Causerie de Mercredi, or in Arabic it's called Hadith Arbia. And of course, it makes you immediately think about Sainte-Beuve and his Causerie du Lundi. So my dissertation was really about like the two causeries together, one by Sainte-Beuve in the 19th century, and one by an Egyptian literary critic, well celebrated by the name of Taha Hussein, that he wrote it through the 1920s. But what was interesting about that period was I came just at the moment when structuralism was still at its peak. You know, I mean, the demigods in the field, so to speak, were of course Claude Lévi-Strauss, but also Greimas and Claude Brimont, Morambat just passed away. Michel Foucault just passed away just a year or two before. So I was like really converted to semiotics, especially the semiotics of Greimas. Greimas retired in 1985, and I was in his seminar that was taken over by Jean-Claude Coquet in 1986. And they stayed in that seminar from 1986 all the way to 1991 before I came to the United States. So the semiotic, especially the semiotic of Greimas, it had this kind of like ambition to be scientific, and it was quite rigorous, but it also had a very, very important dimension that eventually it will convert me to anthropology. And that dimension was precisely, structuralism, especially the brand of structuralism that we could read in the work of Claude Lévi-Strauss, because remember, the work of Claude Lévi-Strauss is really about analysis of myth, and myth is a narrative. So Greimas like developed his own like jargon, so to speak, or he calls it meta language, to analyze like all type of narratives with a very specific preference to Le Conte, especially Le Conte de Maupassant. Why Le Conte de Maupassant? Because Le Conte is very close to the folktale. And the folktale has like a very simple, well, a relatively simple structure compared to the novel, or even compared to a short story that you may find in the work of, I don't know, not in the work of Maupassant, but let's say in the work of, who else wrote, but anyway, in the work of writers that kind of like took the Le Conte to a new level that's kind of more sophisticated, and in some ways like it's cut with the tradition of the folktale. So that's basically how I came really to discourse analysis, and I'm going to sum up a little bit, because I know that this question is really like I can speak for days on this one. But as a Maghrebi in France, I mean, this was really so important. I mean, the fact that I became aware of my Maghrebi identity in France, in Morocco, I was not a Maghrebi. I wasn't actually, I was not even, of course I was Moroccan, especially at the time of soccer games and all that. But mostly I was really like from KASC, that's how I could think about myself, especially that I was studying in Fes. So the reference to the city was really important. And in city itself, the reference to the neighborhood is very, very important. So the Maghrebi identity, I had no idea what it was, till I found it in France. And of course, I mean, the first one that, I found out about it was a negative identity. It was not really something nice to be called Maghrebi. And it had other synonyms that were also had like negative connotations. That really made me kind of think about studying Maghrebi history, so I can understand what this concept of the Maghreb is, or at least like I could understand something about myself, because that's the truth at the end. Whatever I wrote, it really had to do with something personal about me. So I tried to find like seminars or courses on colonial history in France. I could not. It was just impossible. By that time, Charles-André Julien retired. He was the only one who was really teaching colonial history at Sorbonne. So I went to the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales. And there were like courses, but it was really pre-modern, So I settled for pre-modern. At least I said, okay, I can understand something about the current Maghreb if I understand something about like the pre-Maghreb. So that's basically how I came. Like on one hand, like I came to semiotics, to discourse analysis, and on the other hand, I came to the study of the Maghreb. I did finish my dissertation like on literary criticism in Egypt and in France, and they had like a golden opportunity to come to the States. Really kind of, it happens because of personal encounter that I didn't expect, And so I came to Princeton. Why Princeton? Because Princeton was the university, in the United States that had strength in North African studies. It had Clifford Geertz. He was at the institute, but still had a connection. He even used to teach classes not in the anthropology department, though. He used to teach classes in the history department with Robert Danton. And then it had Larry Rosen, who is like a leading anthropologist of the Maghreb and even a pioneer of legal anthropology, tout court. And then, of course, there was Harold Gears, Gears' former wife. And there was Abdullah Hammoudi. We came almost the same year, 91. And then in political science, there was a major North Africanist by the name of John Waterbury, who wrote a book, a very important book. That's a classic in North African studies. It's called Commander of the Faithful. It's about structure of the Makhzen in Morocco. So that's basically like, how I came to, when I came to Princeton, there was something very, very interesting that happened. Of course, I came with this background of structuralism, but only to find out that structuralism was dead. That's what I was told. It's only like structuralism is dead, And but I cling to it in many ways actually, because interpretive anthropology of Clifford Geertz was really dominant, not only in Princeton but even beyond Princeton. Even it's still very kind of like important today. So there was also like another development that happened that was also unexpected. In France, when I was at the École, I used to study like historical anthropology. Historical anthropology pertains to history, meaning the École has a division. It's called history and civilization, and all the historians are there. And of course, most of the historians, big names at that time, like Le Goff and like, of course, Lucette Valency and Jocelyne Dakhliya and many others, used to do historical anthropology. But when I came to the States, historical anthropology pertains to anthropology, not to history. So that's basically like how my kind of like fundamental formation, took place in this, especially in these two places, the Sorbonne, École des Hautes Études, and Princeton. After graduation, I was lucky enough. I mean, I was extremely lucky actually to have my first job with Clifford Geertz, and my conversion to anthropology became really total. Meaning like I became Geertzian at that time. And they had this kind of like a background that seemed to be at odds with each other, because on one hand, I was fascinated, and as I said, I was also converted totally to interpretive anthropology and to anthropology in general. But on the other hand, there was something quite fascinating for people my generation, which was basically post-colonial studies in the work of Edward Said. So that was really major. And of course, I mean the two do not really combine well. As a matter of fact, there are debates, that were kind of like intense between Clifford Geertz and Edward Said, not as intense as the one that Michael Walzer had with Edward Said, which was extremely nasty. But the one between Edward Said and Clifford Geertz was also like, was quite intense. And they had to combine these two. I mean, like I had this like, double background that I was struggling to kind of like combine in my own work. And so I don't know whether I did that like successfully or not, but at the same time, I feel that it was a great chance for me to kind of find myself inscribed in this like very, very important trance of intellectual movements, especially in the United States, but also like my background in semiotics stays with me as well. So now the second question, which is about the discourse analysis. As I said, like I was converted, or I was not converted, actually I was initiated to discourse analysis, especially the semiotics of Greimas, which is extremely rigorous. And also it's extremely kind of like esoteric. And when I say that, I mean that it takes years to kind of like get initiated to it, So you invest so much in something like that. And when you do, after 3, 4, 5 years, you will not be able to let go of it really that easily. So I cling to it. I mean, I don't think anyone references Grimas. I reference Grimas in every publication I write. And so, but for me, it was, besides the fact that, as I said, it was like a first like initiation to something that they believed and they still believe is very important. I also believe that like text is really what we have at the end, even when you do field work, even when you talk to, I don't know, migrants, you write that down, they become text. And therefore, they need to be analyzed as such. And of course, we cannot analyze, text just like spontaneously or without preparation. They need certain tools that, that one needs to master to be able to analyze text very well. The ones that I choose, I mean, of course, is Grimas, but there are other tools that other theoreticians, such as Claude Brimont or such as, I don't know, Christiva, to mention just names like in the French context. Of course, in the US context, you have also Clifford Geertz, who was converted to that type of analysis. And he even claims that it's semiotics, and it is semiotic, but of different order, So for the question of secularism, that was really also like a conversion that happened when I got my first job, because my first job with the Clifford Geertz was really not a first job. It was more like an honorary position, meaning like I was at the institute and I didn't have any obligations except to do my work. Whereas like when I got my first job as a visiting assistant professor at New School, that was a job. So that I had to teach, and New School has a certain tradition, First of all, it has a Marxist tradition. And second, it has a phenomenological tradition. And by the time when I got there, the anthropology department added a new tradition by itself, which is basically the anthropology of secularism that was kind of like put in place by Talal al-Assad. By the time I came to the institute, Talal al-Assad left to Johns Hopkins, but his legacy was still there. I met him even there, as a matter of fact, a few times. So, of course, I mean, the type of secularism that Talal al-Assad talks about is very different from the one that I thought about for Talal al-Assad, because he was in a specific context. The context, of course, is the context of the United States. And his reaction was to the interpretive anthropology of Clifford Geertz, and especially to the, Geertz has a very important article, a chapter. It was an article, and this became a chapter in his book, The Interpretation of Cultures. And that chapter is called Religion as a Cultural System. And Talal al-Assad made really kind of like a rigorous critique of that chapter, and developed his own really kind of a new idea that anthropology, the word, not anthropology, I mean religion, the concept of religion is a concept that was created in the context of the Enlightenment, Talal al-Assad had a different trajectory, of course, that kind of shaped the way he was interested in secularism. And that tradition had to do, of course, with his own upbringing. The fact that, of course, I mean, he was born in Saudi Arabia from a Saudi mother and Austrian Jewish Muslim convert's father, very known now by the name of Muhammad Assad. And but he grew up in Pakistan. So when we say Pakistan, it's India, meaning it's British colonialism. And then when we say also Pakistan, we are thinking about like that first state that's going to be founded as a Muslim state, so that's really kind of like the background of Talal al-Assad. On one hand, he was kind of like, he found himself kind of like surrounded by this, kind of religiosity that we call Islam. But on the other hand, he was like, kind of like, grew up, developed in a British colony. As a matter of fact, even when he left Pakistan to go to study in England, he went to Oxford, and he studied with Evans Pritchard. Evans Pritchard was a colonial officer, and he's one of the pioneers of anthropology. And so that's where that Asst was formed. And therefore, like his look into secularism is really like impacted by that trajectory that had British colonialism on one hand, but also like Islam, especially Islam in Pakistan. You know, I mean, Pakistan has a strong like Muslim identity. You know, my background was different. Meaning, when I became interested in secularism, my background was different. Meaning, like Morocco, it's pretty much like of course it's a Muslim country, but we don't even feel that about it. It's just like, meaning Islam is just like, it's like something that's so kind of ingrained that we take it for self-evident. It's not something that we think about that much, you know, because the identity is Moroccanness, and Moroccanness has many layers, you know, many different kind of ethnicities, you know, even languages, historical experiences, and so forth. So we don't concentrate on Islam, you know. So, and state itself is not secular. I mean, it never claimed to be secular. As a matter of fact, it claims to be Muslim. So therefore, like in the Moroccan identity, you know, that I grew up with, was very, very different from the kind of like background that I said, you know, I grew up with. But for me, what made it even more kind of like important is the fact that I moved to France. And then, of course, in France, as I said earlier, you have the Maghrebi identity, you know, that's forced on you. And then Maghrebi also means, of course, it means Arab, but also it means Muslim. And the three concepts are not necessarily positive. As a matter of fact, they're not positive at all, you know. So therefore, like you think about your identity in terms of the French experience. The French experience is marked by what we call laïcité. It's really a kind of French brand of secularism, a French brand of secularism, you know, that was created, you know, specifically, you know, to exclude Islam from the get-go. When you look at the first like definition of the state of secularism, you know, it says what, you know, what secularism is, you know, what laicity is, but it mentions the religion that laicity, you know, is kind of defined vis-a-vis it. And Islam is not there. So, I mean, of course, you have Catholicism, Protestantism, Israelites, you know, that's the term that's used in the definition, but Islam is not there. But at the same time, we know that like the concept of laicity itself was kind of formulated in 1905. 1905, that's the peak of colonialism in especially in Algeria, as a matter of fact, you know. So I always say that it's very, very interesting because it happened really in the context of Algeria. And you will be surprised to know that the ulama, which is like Muslim scholars, they wanted laicite. They said, yeah, we want that, you know. Why? Well, because like, first of all, it allows them, you know, to have their own space, you know, a religious space, not invaded by colonials, you know. In Algeria at that time, there are sometimes called awqaf, which is basically Muslim endowments. And the colonial state interfered, as a matter of fact, in Muslim affairs, like, you know, I mean, all kinds, like financial and political and religious and so forth. And the Muslim ulama, the Muslim scholars, the ulama, they were very kind of like militant, you know, to ask France to adopt laicite on them. So, but again, like what I'm saying is that like the experience of French laicite or French secularism is very different from the one that, you know, that we see, especially in the anthropology of religion today, especially in the tradition of Talal Asad and his students, Sabah Mahmoud and Ali Agrama and Charles Hirschkind, you know. So, of course, I mean, like when we say secularism, we are talking about a discourse, you know. But in my case, I don't say just discourse. I say imaginary. Of course, I mean this concept may come across as obnoxious and pretentious and pedantic, but it's a very important concept in my view. Why? Because in addition to the discursive dimension of secularism, it points to something very, very different. Discourse does not just communicate ideas. Discourse does not only kind of like serve power, but discourse also shapes, our conceptions, our views of the social world, and that views and those conceptions of the social world, that's what I call imaginary in the tradition, of course, of, feminology.
Yeah, thank you so much for that rich set of responses, Majid. So there are different threads that I could pull from your response, but I'm actually going to focus on the latter part where you're talking about different manifestations, different interpretations of secularism, different translations, we might call them. And translation is a major theme of your work, building off of, but also diverging a bit from the seminal work of Talal Asad on anthropology as a form of cultural translation. So I'm interested in how your views on translation have evolved over time. And I actually found an earlier version of your article, Translation and the Imaginary, from over 2 decades ago.
Yeah.
And that is something that shows up in your book as a heavily revised version. So for example, your concept of translation ideology as a variable that produces different translations, that concept of translation ideology, it seems to be relatively new. So my question is, what implications does this concept of translation ideology have for the way that we as readers approach texts or different forms of discourse?
So I understand those are 2 questions. I mean, the first one is about like how I come to the issue of translation, and the second one is more specific about translation ideology.
Yes.
The way I came to the issue of translation was almost inevitable. I was working on really my second dissertation about the Kahina. And the Kahina is a story, basically. It's a very, very short story. It's about a woman that's, that was from, North Africa and resisted the Arabs, and then she was killed by them. I mean, it's as short as I still have like a letter, because at that time there was no email. I mean, your advisor just leaves you a note in your mailbox, and the note says, you cannot write a dissertation about this topic. You don't even have a story here. And of course, I mean, like when I started doing research, I realized that there's so much. But what intrigued me was also like the idea that this very, very short story about someone that may have, most likely she must have existed, but we don't know much about her. So her story transforms in radical ways, meaning like it can be, I don't know, like Christian in one narrative, but then Jewish in another narrative, and then even like the fact that she's a woman, that itself transformed and she became a man in another narrative. So, and of course, I mean, like the transformations were just like extremely puzzling. I mean, of course, they were entertaining because like there was some kind of. But Clifford Geertz has this citation. He says, anthropologists are merchants, of entertainment, because whatever we do, like it needs to be kind of like entertaining. It needs to be something so different that like that attracts people. If someone just talks about marriage, it's fine. But if someone comes and tells us that there are some societies that don't know the marriage, then we are kind of very intrigued. So in the case of the Kahina, there was that dimension, really kind of like, of, entertainment, of enchantment even. But beyond that, like I was intrigued by why this short story transforms so much in a radical way. And then immediately after the book came out, I gave a lecture at the University of Chicago, and And when I came back, the first time that I knew, I was contacted by American Anthropology Association, and they wanted me to write a piece about translation. And that's how basically that piece that I wrote, it was published in Anthropology News. But I was not satisfied with it, you know, I mean, like because it was just a couple of pages. It was almost like a reaction for me to what translation is, you know. But the idea of translation, I mean, stayed in my mind, and I realized that it was ubiquitous in what I do, especially what I do is you know, discourse analysis. So till not necessarily when I wrote the new 3 chapters, even before, I was interested in reading more about translation. So basically, I read stuff about translation, including the work of that I found very important, the work of Paul Ricoeur. But I noticed that, of course, and Benjamin about that. But what I noticed was like when people talked about translation, they were talking about literary translation only. And with the exception of Talal Asad, he also has an article about like what he calls cultural translation that came out, I think, in 1996. That was before he published the book on secular translations. But when I looked at Talal Asad, he used Benjamin, you know. But it was very, very interesting for me because he used the concept, a couple of concepts from Benjamin. One that all translation theorists agree with. The idea that like translation is impossible and it's doable, you know, as Paul Ricoeur put it. It's impossible, meaning you really cannot translate, you know, I mean, whatever statements you can, you know, you can't, because meaning like you cannot convey the original meaning. That's just impossible because of...
It's faithful melancholy, right?
Yeah. And then the second one, it's doable because like we have been doing translation all the time. We are doing translation right now as we speak. So, and the third thing that was even more kind of like intriguing was the fact that Benjamin, who also says the same thing, he says that translation is not possible, but it's doable. He talks about like, you know, what a good translation is. And then he says that a good translation is the one that reproduces the intentio, you know, that's not the intention, the intentio. He used a Latin word. Talal Asad used that concept, you know, when he was talking about cultural translation, you know. And then a few other anthropologists also would mention the intentio when they talk about translation. But there was something so kind of like evident that they didn't pay attention to. The piece of Benjamin on the task of the translator was a preface, or if you will, an introduction to his translation from French, you know, to German. So it's very interesting in the complexity of it. So the man, like, you know, he translated Proust and he translated Baudelaire, Les Fleurs de Mal. Actually, the introduction that I'm talking about, it was a translation of Baudelaire, Les Fleurs de Mal. And he translated that to, you know, to German. And then, of course, that was translated retranslated in 1966 into English. And it was the English text that became kind of like heuristic, you know, and gave birth to this amazing scholarship on translation, you know. But the irony in that situation is when Benjamin talks about intention and the inability of the translator to translate, he was really talking about poetry, you know. And not only about poetry, it's about specific poets, you know. It's Charles Baudelaire, you know. So meaning like each translation of whatever genre and even whatever author has its own challenges, you know. So his was really specific, you know. I mean, like when you read Baudelaire and when you read translations into English or whatever into German, then you will understand what Benjamin is talking about. But how come that like that concept that was really kind of invented in the context of poetry, and the poetry of Baudelaire became somehow universal, that we can use about any other translation, you know. Now, um, the specificity of other cultural forms, such as ethnography, that Asad was talking about, or such as historiography, that I was interested in, you know, in relation to translation, they have completely different dynamic, meaning, like they are not literary texts, even though they have literary qualities, you know, and they have specific, like, you know, epistemes that are different from kind of, you know, a poetry. Therefore, the intention or the intention that Benjamin talks about becomes very problematic when you try to put it into another context, you know. So that's when, like, I had to go back to Grimas, you know. Why? Because Grimas elaborated something that's called narrative grammar, you know, and also, you know, kind of like he had a vision about what a text is, or even, you know, what a narrative is, you know. And for him, that this was really very, very important, like, you know, to my own analysis. You have, you know, yeah, I mean, like he comes, there is a whole tradition behind Grimas himself. I mean, he comes from Louis himself and so forth. But to make it like as simple as possible in this discussion, whenever you have a narrative, you have like the semantic side of it, you know, what Grimas in a very jargon language would call, you know, the substance of the form, you know. And then, of course, you have the syntax, what also Grimas would call the form of the expression, you know. And to make it simpler, the form of the expression is the ensemble of actors and actants that you find in a narrative. You know, let's say we are talking about, I don't know, French Revolution. You have a number of, like, you know, characters, you know, historical individuals, you know, and then they have certain relations between them, you know. I mean, you have the ones that come with positive connotations, and you have the one who come with negative connotations, and you have transformations of those characters within the narrative itself. And then, of course, when it comes to semantics, you have this kind of like semantic field, you know, that's marked by specific like semantic units, you know, that we call SAM, in the jargon of Grimas. And you find like a number of SAM that are clustered together and created a unit that Grimas also calls isotopy. So I said, like, if we go about translation this way, you know, rather than just to use the ambiguous, you know, and really unhelpful concept of intention, you know, to history or to historiography or to ethnography, or maybe even to literature, as a matter of fact, if we can go analyzing, you know, the narrative from this point of view, because a character, when it's transformed into another language, can take on different meaning. I mean, like its semantics itself also changes. So, I mean, that's basically like, you know, how I kind of like came to the concept of translation, but really using more like a, you know, a Grimas approach, but also Grimas approach I complemented by something else, you know, which is basically, you know, a certain phenomenology in the tradition of Husserl and also Merleau-Ponty, because it goes back to what I said earlier, because we don't only read text to read them, you know, text also affects our imaginaries, you know, they affect our perception, you know, they shape our understanding of the social world.
I have so many follow-up questions, but I'm looking at the time and I want to make sure that people in the audience have a chance to ask their questions. So you can either raise your hand or you can unmute and speak, or if you prefer, you can write your question in the chat. Though in the interim, I will ask Majid, what is your own translation ideology?
Yeah, you asked me about the translation ideology. These concepts, I elaborated it from a previous concept that's very common, as a matter of fact, even fashionable somehow, amongst linguist anthropologists. Linguist anthropologists, we're talking about Michael Silverstein, we're talking about Susan Gale, Judith Irvine, and others. They talk about language ideology, you know. Language ideology, it was extremely useful concept in the sense that, you know, it's coming from also a tradition of Sapir, you know, Sapirian tradition about language, you know, and that language is not just a means of communication, the way we find it in the work of Saussure, for instance, because Saussure defines language as a means of communication, as a system of science that serves to, you know, communicate. Whereas Sapir, like, you know, and his students, their understanding of language is an ensemble, of course, of science, and those science are really categories by which we comprehend the world, you know, by which we kind of like understand the relations, you know, including power relations and so forth. So his students, or the people who were inscribed in his generation that I just mentioned, they came up with this term of language ideology, meaning you have language itself, whether it's French or English or Arabic or Persian or whatever, and usually language itself, it contains ideology of some sort, you know. I just give a kind of example. I mean, you might find a language that's very misogynistic, you know, in which the categories that refer to certain genders are highly derogatory, you know. That pertains to language ideology. But also language ideology, it refers to our conception of language, you know. And I will just give you, as a matter of fact, in my book, I do give an example. When I was a student, I was a high school student, and our philosophy teacher would talk to us about French. And remember, we are in a context, you know, that was heavily colonized, you know. So we really thought French was the language of the gods, you know. And then the teacher would tell us, listen, French is a scientific language. It's a language that's precise. It's a language that's clear. And then he gives us an example. He said, like, listen, when you ask a French student, you know, how is the weather? French student would say, you know, le ciel est bleu. And the sky is blue. To signify, he said, like, when you ask a student, you know, who speaks Arabic, how is the weather? He would tell you, al-jaw jamil, you know. Al-jaw jamil, it means the weather is beautiful. He said beautiful is ambiguous, is unclear, you know, we don't know what it means, and so on. So what he just said is language ideology. But what he also said, it didn't come from him. That's what like the dominant of French, you know, ideology, you know. I remember just as recently as just a few years ago, I was in Tangier and I was in a context, and it was like the director of the French Institute talking to a couple of Moroccans, and she was really communicating to them same ideas that I just mentioned. She said, like, French is very logical, you know. It's very scientific, it's very objective, it's very clear, and so forth. Well, the truth of the matter is all languages are like that. You know, when you know them very well. We don't know any language that's irrational or pre-logical or illogical. They're all like that. All languages are beautiful in there. So this is like what really kind of, you know, briefly like what linguistic ideology is. I came up with the term uh, translation ideology. I did, after I published this, I found that someone used it, but didn't articulate it as a concept, really. I think I'm the first one to do that. Translation ideology is also pertains to the same thing. First of all, because it does pertain to language ideology, you know, that the translator does have a certain ideas about the language that they use to translate from and the language they use to translate. I had a friend of mine actually, and he translated the work of some of the work actually of Todorov, you know. And then I asked him, he met him, and he told me when I talked to him, I only spoke English to him. He told me, why didn't you speak French to him? He told me because like I need to convey to him, you know, that like I mastered language, you know, that his text will go to. You know, he told me like if I speak French to him, he will know that like I'm kind of like I have an accent, an American accent. I make mistakes and all that. He told me so, which was a very clever strategy of a translator. He used like uh, um, um, English or American actually language ideology, to talk to the person that he's going to translate for. So translation ideology, again, it pertains to the understanding of language that we have, the idea that we have of language, the one that we translate for, and that the one what we translate for, to. And then it also pertains to a slew of other things, such as our conception of translation. The first thing that you find, for instance, in the translation ideology is that, I can translate this. I did argue with a lot of translators. They would tell me, no, when I translate Baudelaire, is Baudelaire. I said, no, it's not Baudelaire. I said, the proof that it's not Baudelaire, Baudelaire himself cannot read it. But they would insist that, so their idea that that's Baudelaire, that's ideology, not something else. So also like the translators, I mean, we can talk about a lot of details when they always talk about equivalence, and that's also an idea, translation ideology, to believe that like each word in a certain language has its equivalent or equivalence in another language. And to make the things even worse, the translator themselves, they are usually faced with several equivalents. And what makes a translator choose one equivalent over another? I will just give you an example. Why Catherine, what's her name? Forgot her name. Harrington, I think the first translator of Fanon, she translates colon as settler. Whereas Richard Philcox, the translator of 2004, he translates colon as colonialist. The two are not the same. So the translation ideology is also like what makes a translator decide about certain equivalents against other. But also translation ideology is what makes a translator believe that a text is worthy of translation. That text deserves to be translated, that it has to be translated. Because not all texts are translated. None of my books were translated into French, actually, at all. And most likely because of the context of the translation ideology, it will be deemed, at least in the actual context, because of course things change all the time. Maybe in 30 years, they will be translated into French. But right now, like the translator and their ideology would not kind of like make the invention of the Maghreb book worthy of translation. Why? Because of what I said, like, translation ideology is an ensemble of ideas that govern, the crafts, because it's a craft, the craft of translation. And the proof again that there is something called translation ideology is the multiplicity of translation. Jean Hippolyte, I think it was 1952, he translated Hegel into French. And Michel Foucault makes a comment on that translation. Of course, he was his professor, and he got him to the Collège de France. But he said the translation of Jean Hippolyte is so good, he said, that like some German philosophers, go and after they read Hegel in German, they make sure that they would read Jean Hippolyte in French. But if it was no kind of like other perception or other kind of understanding or ideologies of translation, we would only have translation of Jean Hippolyte. We have 2 or 3 more translations since 1952 of the same book. And we can say the same thing about Ibn Khaldun. We can say the same thing about like my friend who was translating Charles Baudelaire, actually. And he thought that the other translation is not good. That's also part of translation ideology. So that's basically like, briefly what concept means.
You anticipated a lot of my follow-up questions. I mean, I was going to ask questions on your chapter on Fanon. I was personally a bit surprised that you said, well, in some ways, Constance Farrington's 1963 translation has been, more faithful to Fanon's original text than Richard Philcox's, because the Philcox translation is the one that academics tend to prefer. But I want to just make sure again that audience members have a chance to ask their questions. I know that we're running out of time here. If you want to ask a question, raise your hand or put it in the chat. Okay, Gloria Young has a question here. She says, Dr. Hannoum, congratulations on your book. Thank you for speaking with us today and for your contributions to academia. I was a student of yours 12 years ago. Your classes were instrumental in my academic and intellectual development. I want to thank you for helping me learn to challenge my own culturally embedded biases and to gain the tools for seeking context for complex topics. I was looking for a question there, but this is more of a comment. Thank you, Gloria. Anyone have a question? I have more questions, but I want to respect our time limits. Majid, I'm sure that we will have opportunities to chat more about this. Glenn, do you have anything to add?
No, but I want to thank you both for a very interesting and enlightening discussion. Yeah, I look forward to rereading what I've read and reading the rest of the book in light of the discussion. So thanks for that. Yeah, will everybody please join me in thanking both Sophia and Majid for their time this afternoon. It was a great way to round out our activities for the academic year. And we look forward to continuing such discussions in the future.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you, Glenn. Thank you, Majid.
Yeah, thanks so much, Sophia. It was great. It was great, like an engagement, actually.
Thanks.
Bye, everyone.